Hey everyone, it's me, EODGamer here, and today we are going to be making the first in a series of class-specific videos. And in the hunt category, which is really a single target DPS kind of role, we have 4 characters: Danheng, Seele, the new Yanqing in CBT3, as well as Sushang. Now these 4 characters generally have one specific trait that defines them versus other classes, and that is definitely their very high amounts of base speed. Out of all of the characters in Honkai Star Rail, you can see that the 4 of them already take up the top 6 spots in Honkai Star Rail. And basically, if you plot the table in terms of their stats against each other, and then we just do this heat map, taking into account that these are DPS characters, so we just want to focus on like attack and speed, we can see very clearly that Seele and Yanqing have a significant amount of attack versus their 4-star hunt class counterparts. It's about 20% higher base attack. Base attack is very significant because percentage appliers will then add on to this base attack to use for final calculation. And you can see that for 4-star counterparts are a significant amounts of disadvantage when it comes to the amount of damage they can dish out for this reason. But are all 4-star useless? We'll talk about that in a little bit. But now, let's go on to another question that some of you might be asking. Is Seele or Yanqing, who is better, and which one is actually going to be better for the long term? Because Seele, as you know, is a limited 5-star character, while Yanqing here is actually a 5-star standard character, which you can actually get from like a bit the selection wishes that you can pull if you just want to fill the hunt role, and who actually does higher DPS. Now, before we jump in terms of the comparison, we need to first understand what do they exactly do. And the example of Seele I have, if any of you been playing another turn-based game, gacha game called Epic 7, she's really like Kisei from that category. She's a very fast damage dealer that aims to burst down units very quickly. She has the highest base speed in the game and also has speed modifiers, as we'll see shortly. So in terms of her skill, ultimate, and talent, this is what she does. She basically does a very good amount of multiplier, but I'm not going to bore you with all the details. Let's just highlight a few key things, and you can really read. I built this website on my own, so go ahead and check it out on your own time. I've updated all the information as of CBT3, the final CBT as well. But really, what I wanted to highlight here is that Seele also gains a 25% speed boost for 2 turns when she uses her skill. This is best in class. Out of all 4 of them, she has the highest amount of percentage speed gain already. On top of that, her base speed of 115 is also the highest, making her clearly the fastest character in the game, especially with this 25% speed buff. And of course, the other thing that makes Seele unique versus the rest of them is definitely the extra attack that she does, and in her buff state that she gets, she also does an additional 80%. This extra turn is when she defeats an enemy, so she can actually be a good small mob killer in terms of when she eliminates a small mob, she goes again, and this gives her a pseudo AoE nature as well. But I think what is underrated is this damage percentage increase when she's in a buff state. When she kills a new, she gets a huge amount of damage buff and acts again, making her a very lethal unit, especially on bosses that like to summon small enemies. Now let's talk about the other 5-star characters, Yanqing. And in terms of Yanqing's kit, it differs quite significantly to Seele in a sense where while Seele plays around with eliminating targets and having pretty good speed on her own, Yanqing supports himself in other ways in terms of having very good amounts of crit buff. If you see here, his crit rate buffs that he gets is actually 60% from his ultimate and 20% crit rate from his talent already when he gets in terms of the empathetic sword passive that he has. So he has like 80% crit rate buff and already has some other crit damage multipliers. It is. Of course, the downside is when he takes damage, this effect is gone, but it definitely clearly gives him a very good early game head start versus Seele, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But tons of stats, 80% crit rate, that's no small amount by any means, and a huge crit damage, 30% as well. But one thing to note is, of course, when he hits even a crit, his speed is 10% increased, and it's not as significant as compared to Seele's 25% that we talked about slightly earlier. And now how do they compare side by side? Let's look at their stats again real quick. We can see here that in terms of Seele and Yanqing's comparison, Yanqing has a slightly higher base attack but much lower speed. And of course, we talked about their speed percentage multipliers. Seele has a 25% speed gain, Yanqing only has a 10% speed gain when you compare them side by side. So Seele moves a lot faster with a slight detriment, like 5% less base attack. And of course, if you talk about defensive stat, they trade off. One is slightly weaker in terms of HP and one is slightly weaker in terms of defense. And I first think the first classification to compare these two characters really is Yanqing is clearly a better early game character compared to Seele because he gets 80% crit rate when his passive is up, whereas Seele doesn't get that huge amount of crit rate. So in the early game, when a lot of people are testing their closed beta and a lot of people are commenting that Yanqing just feels much better to use, is because that in the early game you don't get access to a lot of crit rate gear that you have, and also your substats don't roll into very perfect gear in terms of getting that crit rate, which means that Yanqing will always be landing many more crits compared to Seele in the early game. So it's no wonder that a lot of people might feel that he's really good now. But when you play the game for maybe 6 months to a year and you start getting all the end game crit rate gear, as well as you are focusing more on crit rate substat rolls, you'll realize that 80% crit rate means that your cap off at crit rate is 20%, which means that if you are hitting his ultimate and you are proccing the whole 80%, sure, you hit 100% guaranteed chance to crit rate. But then if you are using his skill on the other hand, not his ultimate, you lose 60% of the crit rate, which means that you are hitting a crit 40% of the time only. And if you try to push beyond that 40%, all that crit rate will just be wasted when you're using his ultimate and overcapping on crit. This is why he's better for the early game, but later as you go on and you get access to more crit rate gear, he starts to fall off very significantly because of this non-critting if he is not using his ultimate. 60% is pretty massive and it does affect things in the late game very significantly. Seele is clearly better late game. She doesn't have that crit rate diminishing return problem, but of course you need to have pretty good gear in order to see her start to pop off, and she does pop off very well. And next, of course, Seele has a better AoE in terms of her abilities. She gets to go again, especially if he kills a small mob. Whereas Yanqing, you really want him to hit the main boss consistently and let your other units deal with the sub-mobs. For Seele, on the other hand, you can use her to eliminate the sub-mobs and go directly for the boss with an enhanced attack with a self-buff as well. Clearly, much better AoE when you need it, but both largely still single nature in a sense. Of course, the next thing is Seele is of a rarer element. Out of the characters that we only have one Quantum 4-star, and the other two right now, and a supposed third one, is all going to be a Quantum limited 5-star. Whereas Ice, pretty common. Some of you might be using Herta, March 7th, or even Gepard already, and that's your Ice damage that you can be accessing from there. In terms of their trace, it's about the same. I looked at all of the traces and I summed them all up. Both of them get 28% attack from their trace, and Seele gets crit damage, while Yanqing gets ice damage in terms of the multipliers. I'll be doing more videos once the game goes live to compare like what exactly is the optimal, like is one crit damage equals to one elemental damage. But for now, let's just assume that this ratio is fair and even, and both of them scale equally well. And now let's move on to the two 4-stars and talk about if the 5-stars are already so much better in terms of their base stats, do 4-stars have no place and are they useless in Honkai Star Rail? And let's look at the kid right now. She's mainly a physical DPS unit in Honkai Star Rail. She's really like a weakness breaking specialist where she does more damage when the enemy is weakness broken. As you can see here, the first ability we have here, weakness break already guarantees her sword stance to trigger, which is additional damage that she does. And also when she uses her ultimate, she also advances her action forward by 100%, similar to Seele's example of when she kills a unit. But for Sushang's, when she uses her ultimate, she immediately advances her action. What this means is you can actually use her skill, do 200% multiplier. If the enemy is weakness broken, you add on another 100%, so that's 300%. You use her ultimate for another 320%, that's like 600%, and you follow up with another skill, that's like 1000% of attack multiplier. Just very rough mathematics, but it's very good amounts of damage for Sushang. She doesn't need to rely on attack buffers or speed buffers because this is guaranteed advanced action forward moving again. And of course, in terms of a talent, when there is weakness broken enemy on the field, she actually gets a very strong 20% speed buff. Very independent character. You can pretty much just be plug and play into most team comps, especially if there's a physical weakness enemy and you don't play like Clara or physical MC. She's definitely a very solid character to break physical weaknesses as well. In terms of Danheng's skills, some of you might already have noticed or heard from my other tier list videos already that I put out. What makes Danheng unique really is the ability to reduce the target speed. Out of all of the characters on this list, he's the only one that can reduce enemy speed. So this is very significant because reducing enemy's speed basically speeds up your whole team, especially when you're fighting against a boss monster. reducing the enemy speed, it effectively gives your whole team a faster movement speed as well. And on top of that, he has on average like a 10% speed increase, because 50% times 20%, on average a 10% speed increase, which is on par with Yanqing, slightly slower than Sushang, but I think this reduced target speed makes him versatile in the sense that he can not only just be a DPS, but he can also become more of like a boss controller later on, and not really solely become like a hunt class. Could even see himself as like a pseudo nihility debuffing class, as well as a damage dealer class on the side. In this aspect, I think this what differentiates him versus the other 5-star counterparts as well. Let's just use one word to summarize each and every single one of these characters, and Danheng really is his versatility. You get good value out of him in the early game in terms of damage, and late game, once you get that crit rate on him, he starts to become a very strong boss controller. Seele is definitely a late game character. Early game, without any critting at all, she does start to feel a bit lackluster, especially if the content starts becoming more difficult than your artifact luck can catch up with. And I'm sure most of us have very bad artifact luck, such as myself. And of course, Yanqing is a very strong early game unit, getting up to 80% crit rate from his stats. And of course, Sushang is a very independent unit to have in terms of being able to dish out solid amounts of physical damage and weakness breaking, while not really requiring some sort of dedicated shielder or speed up unit to rely on. I do encourage you to check out these tier list videos, which I put out on their respective 5-star and 4-star tiers respectively. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.